So, have you ever caught yourself changing your voice, your words, or even where you put your hands because of who you're talking to? Because I know that I have, right? And for years, I didn't even realize I was doing it. Hey, I'm Tanya, and welcome to Blaque Noire if you're new here. This is my series called Conversations That Matter. It's a series where we explore the conversations that many of us Black women are already having sort of in our own minds, but we don't always hear spoken about out loud. These episodes, they're not tied to a particular week or theme or anything like that. They're simply conversations that I believe are important enough to slow down, sit with, and really explore the topic together, openly, honestly, and without rushing to any easy conclusions. So, there is a version of me, right, that walks into certain rooms, and before I've even entered these rooms, right, I've already checked my tone, I've softened my face. I've already decided which words sound professional, okay, which emotions are safe, and how much of myself the room is likely to tolerate. And the strange thing is, right, after doing that for so long, I didn't even realize that I was doing it anymore, okay? And that is what we call code switching, right? People often describe code switching as changing just the way that you speak. And yes, that is definitely part of it, right? But for many Black women, it is so much deeper than changing an accent or using different words. It's this constant calculation of like how we're being perceived, right? It's deciding whether your confidence will be read as competence or potentially arrogance, right? Whether your frustration will be understood as frustration or turned into aggression, right? Whether being fully yourself will make people uncomfortable. It's knowing that other people are allowed to enter a room exactly as they are, right? While we feel as though we have to arrive almost already edited. So today I want to talk honestly about what that really does to you. Not only like at work or anything like that, but generally what that does to you on the inside, okay? Because there is a version of you that everybody sees as capable, polished, composed. And then there's the version of you that has been working behind the scenes the entire time, right? Making sure that the first impression feels safe enough for you to be accepted. Okay, I'm letting you know now, right? This is not going to be one of those detached, non emotional conversations for me, right? Because code switching has been a part of my life since way before I even knew what it was or what I was doing. I think I've mentioned before, but probably mainly on my Instagram, right, that I grew up in a predominantly white area. I say predominantly, my family were the only Black family there, okay? So from quite a young age, I was fully aware that I was different and not always in a way that made me feel special or proud, right? A lot of the time, it made me feel less than, it made me feel unattractive, it made me feel or wonder whether people really understood me or whether they had already made their minds up about who I was before I even had a chance to show them who I was, right? When like the beauty around me didn't look anything like me, right? When, the girls or your friends who were treated as desirable looked nothing like me. And when the version of femininity that seems to be celebrated feels so far removed from me. And it can really quietly affect how someone sees themselves, right? Being honest, I don't think I consciously ever sat down as a child, right, and decided to become a different version of myself. It was a lot more subtle than that, right? I learned to observe. I learned to notice what was accepted, what was praised, what was mocked, and what made people uncomfortable, right? I learned that belonging could sometimes depend on how well I could make other people, I guess, forget that I was different, okay? And I think that is where code switching often begins, long before the workplace, long before any corporate language, long before you start deliberately changing like the way that you speak. It begins when you learn through sometimes painful experiences, right? That some parts of you are just more welcomed than other parts, right? So growing up in a white area meant that I often saw myself, I guess, through a lens that basically wasn't created for someone who looks like me, right? I didn't always feel like the standard. I felt like the exception, right? And when you're constantly positioned as the exception, it's very easy to begin questioning whether the things that make you different, that you actually probably like about yourself, right, are potentially the very things that make you seem less desirable, less understandable, or less worthy of being chosen, right? So for me, that affected me more than simply how I thought I looked at others, right? It affected how visible I allowed myself to be, which is kind of strange because I've always been a fairly confident person, right? But when you already feel as though the people around you might not understand you, you can then become more comfortable, right? You may become the person who always reads the room before speaking and therefore adjusts herself, right? The person who thinks through how a joke's going to land, the person who wonders whether their excitement is too loud, whether their confidence is too much, whether their response will confirm some sort of biased stereotype, right, that some people probably already have about Black people or Black women in particular. You start learning how to make yourself legible and non-threatening to people who haven't had to learn you, right, or even try to understand you. And that in turn can create a very complicated relationship with yourself because you're not necessarily pretending, okay? Because there is a version of you, right, that might be a bit quieter, a bit more measured, more reserved, or more polished, right? I mean, it's still you, right? But that version of you just isn't the whole you, right? She may be the part of you that you've developed and probably perfected by now, right? Because she knows how to survive in particular environments, right? And that distinction matters, okay? Because code switching isn't always a complete performance, right? Sometimes it's a carefully selective, I guess, release of yourself, right? You've decided which parts of you are safe enough to be seen, which parts need translating, and which parts of you need to stay private. And the problem with this is that, like, when you do that for years, you can begin to forget that you were even making a selection at all. And then this like semi-real version of yourself that you've carefully curated then becomes the only version of you, right? Um, and maybe because you've been doing it so long, you no longer feel safe with showing the whole you, right? Then you enter the workplace, and all of those early lessons suddenly become professional skills. I'm speaking for myself here. I've worked in environments that are predominantly white, and I know what it feels like to be very aware of how I'm presenting myself and how I come across to people, right? How I speak, how I express an opinion, how truly relaxed I actually allow myself to become. Whether I'm being seen as capable, difficult, warm, intimidating, confident, or even too confident, right? There's this unspoken pressure to be not only good at your job, right, but also the need to be seen as being easy for everybody else to receive, right? You learn the language of the room. You learn how to communicate, with like different authority figures, right? What kind of humor is acceptable? What references, everybody's going to understand? And what version of, I guess, professionalism has been defined as neutral, even when it's not actually neutral at all. And so therefore you just adapt, right? Because you've learned that adapting can help you succeed. It can help you build relationships. It can help your ideas be heard. It can protect your income, your reputation, and your progression, right? Now, I want to be very clear about that because I want to make this point clear that I don't think that as Black women, we should be shamed for code switching, okay? Because quite frankly, there are times where it is strategic. There are times where it's, protective and keeps us safe. There are times where, you're simply communicating in the way that's most likely to get you the outcome that you need or that you want. But what happens is, and I guess what makes it exhausting, is that the code switching is actually rarely only about communication. It's a lot of the time, primarily probably actually about perception, about avoiding misinterpretation. You're not simply asking, how can I express this clearly? What you're really asking is, How do I express this without activating some sort of preconceived stereotype, right? And that is an additional piece of work that many of people, around you never have to do, never have to see, never have to think about. Okay. So for me, I notice, right, my code switching most when I disagree with somebody because I don't always feel as though I have the luxury of simply just being able to disagree. There is so much that I have to think about, right? In particular, when voicing my opinion, especially if it's an opinion that's going against the majority, right? I have to think about my tone. I have to think about my facial expressions. I have to think about whether I'm speaking too quickly, whether I sound too direct, whether my frustration is like visible, whether the other person is likely to describe me afterwards as aggressive, defensive, intimidating, or difficult, all those kind of words. Sometimes I'm not only managing the disagreement itself, but I'm also managing the story that might be told about me simply because I disagreed. And that is a very particular kind of pressure. Other people are able to be blunt, impatient, or visibly annoyed and have it completely understood as simply being a moment, okay? That they were stressed in that moment, that they were passionate in that moment, that they've had a bad day, for example. But as a Black woman, there can be fear that one emotional response will not be treated as simply as something that happened in that moment. It'll be treated as evidence, right? Evidence that you're angry, evidence that you're hard to work with, evidence that you are exactly what someone has already assumed you are, right? So what do? You soften the language, you add extra context, you make your voice calmer than you may actually be feeling, you explain yourself more than the situation requires you to. You may even smile, right, while saying something that doesn't particularly make you feel like smiling, because you are trying to make the truth easier for somebody else to receive. And the thing I think people often miss is that this doesn't mean that you're not confident, okay? It doesn't mean that you don't know how to communicate. Actually, the opposite, right? But what's actually happening is that you are communicating on two levels at once. You're saying what needs to be said while simultaneously protecting yourself from the consequences of actually saying it. Now, let me talk about a stereotype that we all know, the angry Black woman, okay? This stereotype is powerful because you don't need anybody to say the words out loud for it to affect the room. You know it exists. I know it exists. You know that Black women could be described as loud, aggressive, ghetto, intimidating, confrontational, unprofessional, or difficult in situations. Okay, whereas somebody else might simply be described as being assertive, honest, or maybe even strong, right? And because we as Black women know that that stereotype is available, we start trying to almost outrun that stereotype before anything has even happened or even been said. Okay, you become exceptionally composed, exceptionally prepared, exceptionally careful. Okay, you may feel pressure to be warm enough that nobody could possibly feel threatened by you, but strong enough that no one could take advantage. Visible enough to be recognized, but not so visible that you are considered attention seeking. Confident enough to lead, but not so confident that people decide that you need humbling, right? It's this impossible balance because the rules can change depending on who it is that's looking at you or who you're interacting with. And this is where code switching becomes way more than a social adjustment. It becomes emotional labor. You're managing your own feelings whilst at the same time managing other people's comfort and, managing the racial meaning that they may attach to your behavior. And that is a lot to carry, right? While also trying to do your actual job, okay? The stereotype can make you question your own reactions. You can leave an interaction with somebody asking yourself whether you were too much, even when you know that you were perfectly reasonable. You can replay your wording, your expression, your tone. You can begin editing yourself retrospectively, right? Looking for the point where you may have made yourself difficult to understand. And over time, that can make self trust harder. Because instead of asking, was I right? You start asking, was I acceptable? Right? Which is nuts. And as I said before, right, when you've been code switching for long enough, it becomes almost automatic. And I can speak for myself here. But when I enter a room, I scan that room without even realizing. And I have all these thoughts running through my head, okay? Who's here? what's the tone? How formal do I need to be? How much of myself can I bring into this conversation? Is this a room where I can really be relaxed, or is this a room where I need to be perfect, poised, and precise? Your body can make those decisions before your conscious mind even catches up. And that automatic response is part of what makes code switching so difficult to examine. You may genuinely believe that you are simply being professional, adaptable, or socially aware. And to be fair, you may well be, right? But it is worth asking where the choice ends and the conditioning begins. Am I choosing to communicate differently because it serves me in this particular moment? Or am I doing it because I've learned that the unedited version of me is actually unsafe, right? Am I being thoughtful, or am I making myself smaller? Am I maintaining a boundary, or am I just hiding? Am I speaking clearly, or am I over explaining because I'm afraid of being misread? These are not always easy questions to answer, and the answer won't be the same in every single room, right? So I think the downside of automatic code switching is that you can lose contact with your own preference, right? You know what the room requires, but do you know what actually feels natural to you, right? You know how to make everybody else comfortable, but do you know when you're uncomfortable? You know which version of you is successful, but do you know which version of you feels free? That is when the adaptation can begin to feel like self-erasure. Now, the price of code switching is not always as dramatic, okay? Sometimes it's simply the tiredness you can't explain at the end of the day. You've completed your work, you've attended the meetings and had the conversations. From the outside, nothing terrible's happened, but you're exhausted, okay? Because you're not only working, you're also monitoring. You're monitoring your language, you're monitoring your expression, you're monitoring other people's reactions, deciding whether something was a harmless comment or a misunderstanding, or even a microaggression, deciding whether to even address it, right? Deciding whether addressing it would make the rest of the week even more difficult. That constant awareness can keep you in a state of tension, right? It can make connections harder because even when people like you, a question can remain underneath it. Do they really like me? Or do they like the version of me that knows how to exist here? That question can lead to being deeply lonely. Okay. There may be parts of you that, they like your humor, culture, language, vulnerability, anger, softness, or ambition, right? Those parts of you, very few people get to see together. Okay. Different rooms receive different pieces or versions of you and become the only person you then become the only person, I guess, carrying the full picture, right? People don't really know you. Over time, that can create a sense of like fragmentation between you and these parts of your life, right? Not because you're fake, but because you're rarely allowed to just be whole and feel whole. And therefore, it can also create resentment. You may resent the fact that you have to think so carefully. You may resent people who are celebrated for the exact qualities that you've had to learn to suppress. Okay, you may resent yourself for staying quiet, even when staying quiet was the safest or most strategic choice available to you. And then there's the added impact that it can have on your confidence. Although code switching can and does make you incredibly skilled, observant, and emotionally intelligent, but it can also make you overly dependent on external feedback. You become so used to reading the room that you stop actually reading yourself. You know when everybody else is uncomfortable, but you're less certain about whether you're uncomfortable or if you're okay. Now, I don't believe that the answer is to tell Black women to stop code switching and be their true, authentic selves everywhere. Whilst that would be great, and it sounds very empowering, the truth is that's just not realistic, right? In every workplace, not every workplace is psychologically safe. Not every person deserves access to every part of you. Not every battle is worth the professional or emotional cost, okay? And authenticity doesn't mean removing all judgment, boundaries, or strategy, right? Code switching, and I can say this is true for myself, has helped many of us survive and succeed in rooms that were not designed with this in mind. It can be evidence of range, intelligence, and adaptability. The skill itself is not a problem. The problem is when you no longer feel that you have the choice whether to code switch or not. When the edited version of you becomes the only version of you, the only version that can be believed, respected, loved, promoted, or accepted. When you can't just relax, even in spaces that are safe. When you've become so good at anticipating rejection that you reject parts of yourself first. Two things can be true at the same time. Code switching can be a skill, but it can also cost you. It can open doors, but it can leave you wondering who had to stay outside so you could walk through those doors. For me, the goal isn't to become the same person in every single room, okay? The goal is to become the most conscious about when I am adapting and, more importantly, why I'm doing so. I want the choice to basically belong to me. Now, let's talk about the idea of reclaiming yourself, right? It doesn't always look like a dramatic confrontation, suddenly refusing to adjust for anybody, right? Sometimes it starts much smaller. It might be noticing the moment you begin shrinking and asking yourself what you believe will happen if you don't. It might be as simple as saying a direct sentence without adding 5 extra paragraphs to prove you're reasonable, right? It might be allowing a pause instead of filling any silence to make somebody else comfortable. It might be giving yourself permission to feel angry without immediately treating your anger as a character flaw. It might be finding spaces where you don't have to translate yourself at all. Spaces with other Black women like you where the full context of who you are doesn't require any kind of introduction, right? It might be allowing your voice, your humour, your softness, and your certainty to exist in the same room at the same time. And it may also involve accepting that some people will just misunderstand you, no matter how perfectly it is that you perform. There's a freedom in recognizing that you can't manage every single interpretation of you. You can be thoughtful without being timid. You can be professional without being detached. You can be emotional without being unstable. You can be Black without making your Blackness easier for everybody else to consume. For those of us who've been doing this for decades, that kind of reclamation will take time. You may not immediately know where this version of you begins and where it ends, but awareness does matter. And I think every time that you notice yourself editing, you create a moment in which you can choose. Sometimes you will still choose to adapt, but it will be a decision that you make more than like a disappearance. So, to sum up, what I need all of you to understand is that this video is not about predominantly white spaces or saying that we shouldn't be in them. Not at all, far from it. It's simply me weighing in on the discussion that I don't think has had enough, okay? So what I'm really saying is that the version of yourself that nobody sees is not necessarily a completely different woman, okay? She may simply be the woman underneath all the calculation, right? The woman who doesn't have to prepare her tone before telling the truth, right? The woman who didn't have to prove she was safe before being taken seriously. The woman who can just be confident, frustrated, joyful, uncertain, ambitious, soft, and fully human without wondering which stereotype someone might attach to her, okay? I think many Black women know exactly what it is to be praised for being composed, right? While nobody asks what it took to maintain that composure. Okay, so I want to leave you with this question. Where in your life are you communicating with intention, and where are you editing yourself, possibly out of fear? Understand, right, there is no shame in the strategies that have helped us survive, okay? But we deserve spaces where survival is not the only goal, right? We deserve to be able to experience belonging without having to almost disappear inside of it to belong, right? And perhaps the work now is not to become, this fixed version of yourself. Perhaps it's actually just to make sure that every version of you still feels like she belongs to you and she's real. Okay, anyway, that's probably a little bit of a longer one, but I would genuinely love to hear your experiences of this. Do you notice yourself code switching at work or with friends, in relationships, or even in places where you thought you felt comfortable? And, have you ever caught yourself wondering which version of you people actually know? Feel free to share as much or as little that feels right, in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if this conversation resonated with you, I really think just hop over to the Blaque Noire Sisterhood, our private Facebook group, which is a space for honest conversations about what it means to be a Black woman, navigating work, identity, reinvention, confidence, and the parts of life that we're often expected to carry quietly. I will make sure that I pop all the links in the description. If you've liked this episode and feel like, you got something out of it, please, please, please hit the like button and subscribe, and I will see you next time.